So I wanted to create a number of videos that kind of casually walk through some concepts of logic. And so in this first video, what I want to talk about is what logic is. So I think there are two definitions that we can put forward. The first definition is the casual definition, how people generally understand what logic is. Well, with the second definition, it's the more academic definition. It's what you would find in a course or if you picked up a textbook of logic. So let's start with the general definition of logic. The general understanding of logic is it's just a science or art or discipline that aims to separate the good arguments on the one hand from the bad arguments on the other hand. What it aims to do is develop a set of rules or criteria for sorting arguments in one category or the other. Another way that people generally understand logic is they associate it with rational thought. So if you're a logical individual, or if you know a lot of logic, people immediately assume that you have this kind of rational capacity, that you think in a certain way that differs from a lot of other individuals, a lot of people that might be considered more emotional or animalistic. Whether this is right or wrong, I'm just kind of saying what people, I think, when they use the term, how they understand it. The other way people understand the term logic is they have individual that is logical has a certain power of persuasion that maybe some individuals lack. So they have this kind of toolkit, which is they can get people to think the way that they want you to think. And so they can employ these logical or rational arguments to persuade individuals. So this is, I think, the general conception of how people understand the term logic. So there are two different ways that logicians might define logic. Logicians, and by logicians I mean how logic might be defined in a textbook or in a course. There's the formal definition, or what is sometimes called formal logic or symbolic logic, and then there is the informal version of logic, or which is sometimes called critical thinking. I think it's actually easier to talk about the formal or symbolic notion of logic before turning to the informal logic. So let's start with that one first. So what is formal logic? Well, I want to make 2 points with respect to formal logic. The first is that when you pick up a book on formal logic, sometimes called symbolic logic, it looks like math. Specifically, it looks like a lot of algebra. The second thing to think about with respect to a course in formal logic is, what do formal logic do? What can I expect to learn in such a course? I would say that textbooks and courses focus on 3 or 4 things. The first thing is the notion of logical entailment or logical consequence. This notion is, well, what precisely does it mean for a conclusion to follow from a set of premises? If you have a bunch of propositions or statements or reasons, what exactly needs to occur in order for a conclusion or another proposition to follow from that set of propositions? The second thing that is often looked at or focused on are what are called decision procedures. These are just mechanical or algorithmic or step-by-step methods that are used to check an argument, to check to see if the conclusion actually follows from the premises. And these are great things, because rather than having to, employ some kind of gut method for determining if an argument is good or bad, rely upon a sense of logical feeling, determine if the conclusion follows. You just employ a step-by-step method to determine it, which is amazing. You can kind of take all the bias or prejudice out of it. The third thing that's looked at is, what is the third thing? Oh, the third thing is proof systems. Let's say you reason from one proposition to another. Now, you might just kind of reason randomly. You might just move from one premise to the next, or one proposition or sentence to the next. But proof systems develop a set of rules of reason or rules of inference, or what are sometimes called derivation rules, which give everyone that follows that system a set of rules for moving from one proposition to the other. Oh, let me mention the fourth thing that is often focused on in logic courses, specifically formal logic, and that is translation. what you'll sometimes encounter is you'll be given an English sentence or English argument and asked to transform that sentence or argument into a formal language. Now, this can be sort of mind-numbing at times, and sometimes it tests your capacity to understand the English language or whatever language you're translating from into the formal language, but it does have certain benefits. It allows you to, let's say, see your own language through a formal lens. So once you get good at translating a sentence in English or an argument in English into the formal language, then you'll always see those sort of formal ingredients that are found in your own language. Now, it won't be the case that you maybe can provide a translation for every sentence that you could possibly come up with, but it'll give you a tool for seeing your own language through this formal or symbolic lens. So I've given you a definition of logic in general, and now I've talked a little bit about what formal logic is about. The last thing I want to touch on is what informal logic, or what's sometimes called critical thinking, is all about. Now, informal logic deals more with reasoning and arguments in an everyday or public setting. Sometimes you'll have this kind of critical thinking informal logic applied to professional contexts like the medical profession or in work. And in general, you'll find a lot of courses emphasize this notion of critical thinking as a kind of component or objective in the course itself. So what is informal logic? Well, it's hard actually to give you a precise definition of informal logic, as well as determine exactly what informal logic or critical thinking is. And the reason is it's kind of a relatively new discipline. Even though people have been doing it for hundreds of years, there hasn't really been something called informal logic till the 20th century. But here's my idea of what informal logic is. There are two main ingredients or two main things it focuses on. The first is defining or extracting an argument from natural language discourse. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that people talk, and not all that talk contains arguments. Sometimes people ask questions, sometimes they are just describing something they saw, sometimes they are just telling you a story. And not all of that discourse contains arguments. If I give you a list of the things I want at a grocery store, it doesn't contain an argument. So one of the things you would learn in an informal logic course is what is an argument and how to extract or identify arguments from everyday conversation. Now, this involves a number of subtasks about diagramming the argument, sorting the reasons from the conclusion, and just picking apart the various elements of an argument. It also involves some really practical tasks that I think are helpful. One involves identifying implicit premises in an argument. So when we put forward an argument, we don't always state all of the reasons that we have. Some of them are just kind of implied, or it's expected that you know them. In addition, it also helps or trains you to identify the exact conclusion of an argument. Really often people just pick a random conclusion or some conclusion that is suggested by a bit of speech, rather than really narrowing in on the precise conclusion that is indicated by what someone says. So if that's the first kind of component of informal logic, which is identifying what an argument is and trying to learn how to pick it out from natural language discourse, the second thing has to do with evaluating the quality of an argument. This is done in a more informal way, as the name suggests, and there's usually two main criteria that are operative. The first is the notion of relevance. One thing that you'll learn how to do is pick out premises that are relevantly related to the conclusion. A lot of times people will put forward arguments, and those propositions or statements or sentences, they have no bearing really on the conclusion. And so what you would learn in a logic course is what the notion of relevance is, and then various tips and tricks for identifying if a particular part of an argument is relevantly related to a conclusion and which conclusion it's relevantly related to. The other kind of key aspect in this evaluation aspect of informal logic is just learning fallacies. And this is really actually kind of fun. You learn things like the straw man fallacy, ad hominem fallacy, slippery slope fallacies. And all these fallacies are just ways people tend to reason, but reason incorrectly. And you can learn about why people are persuaded by these fallacious or incorrect forms of reasoning. You can learn about how you can avoid them. And to some extent, you can learn about how you could employ them to get people to believe what you want them to believe. I forgot something with respect to informal logic. That has to do with the acceptability of propositions. What I mean by this is that you don't always know if a proposition or a premise or a reason is true or false. And instead, what you will often look at is the acceptability, what's called the acceptability of the premises or propositions of an argument. What I mean by this is, would a reasonable, well-informed individual believe in the premises or propositions that are put forward in the argument? Now, this is a kind of vague notion, but nevertheless, it's one that we employ. If someone gives us some eyewitness testimony, they say they saw a certain fact, well, we want to know a number of things about them. And critical thinking or informal logic will try to tell you what types of things you want to know. You want to know, were they drinking, drinking alcohol? Were they on drugs? Can they see clearly? Do they have any bias? You want to know answers to a number of questions if you would accept their testimony as being, related to the truth or believable. And so it tries to outline this notion of acceptability for a number of different types of arguments. So hopefully this video you've learned about just what logic is all about in the general sense, as well as what you might expect from a course or just an introductory textbook in logic.